Hey y'all, Matt here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about a image that I'm seeing circulating the internet that is basically claiming that the Bible contradicts itself. And this particular image is dealing with 4 different verses and the death of King Saul back in the Old Testament. And what it's saying is that each of these verses basically says that Saul died in a different way, therefore contradicting itself, and therefore the Bible isn't believable. And so this is something that we need to address, and let's talk about it real quick. The first and fourth verses in this image right here, it's basically saying that King Saul was injured in a battle by the Philistines. He was struck with an arrow, and as a result of those injuries, he knew he was going to be captured, and he didn't want to suffer the shame of being captured by his enemy, humiliated and executed. So he basically went to his armor bearer, and he asked his armor bearer, who would have traveled with him in battle, and asked him to kill him. And the armor bearer refused, so he fell on his own sword, killing himself so that he didn't get captured. This is in 1 Samuel 31 verses 4 through 6, and 1 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 4. And these are the first and the fourth things on this image here. Number 2 is saying in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verses 8 through 10, basically says that an Amalekite basically came to King David and told him that he had killed Saul himself. And then the third one is 2 Samuel chapter 21 verses 11 through 13, and it identifies the Philistines as striking Saul down or killing Saul. So we have 3 different accounts of how Saul died. So how do we address this as a Christian if somebody comes to us? And this is actually a very, very simple resolution. Very easily explained away, because all this is it's basically an illusion created by taking scripture out of context. The numbers 1 and 4, 1 Samuel 31 verses 4 through 6, and 1 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 4, both of these are basically accounting the same story. 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles kind of parallel each other in talking about King Saul, and they're both relating what really happened. Saul was fighting in this battle. He got mortally wounded, and he killed himself because he didn't want to be captured by the enemy. And this was a fairly common practice. So if this is what really happened, how do we relate to 2 and 3? 2 is very easily explained. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verses 8 through 10. This is totally just taken out of context by this image. What we really see, if you read the whole story, which context is vital when studying the Bible. This is why we don't read 1 or 2 verses, but we need to read paragraphs, we need to read chapters, we need to read entire books if we have the time and if it's possible. But basically what we see here is this Amalekite, after King Saul had killed himself, he comes across the body of Saul still on the battlefield. And so what this guy does, he sees it as a moment of opportunity, and he basically takes the crown and the wristlets that belong to King Saul, and he takes them for himself, and he travels to King David, who he knows is probably going to be Saul's successor and the next king. And he basically comes before King David and says, hey, I killed King Saul. And his intention here was that he would get a reward for killing King David's enemy. And if you've read the entire book, you know that David and Saul were enemies, but David respected Saul as the anointed king, anointed by God to be king. And he was basically waiting on the appropriate time to become king. And so there were multiple opportunities King David could have killed Saul, but he didn't, because he respected the fact that King Saul was the chosen king by God. And so what happens here, because this Amalekite comes before King David and claims that he kills Saul, David puts him to death, actually executes him, because he killed God's anointed king. And even though it was a false claim, David didn't know that at the time. And so he ends up putting this guy to death because of his lie, claiming that he had killed King Saul. So number 2 is, it is in the scripture, but it's out of context. That's not what happened. The Amalekite claimed to have killed King Saul, but he really didn't. And then number 3, 2 Samuel chapter 21 verses 11-13. It identifies the Philistines as striking Saul down. What we see here, basically, it's more context. This scripture is saying that the Philistines killed King Saul, but it's the context of the battle with the Philistines. During this battle with the Philistines, King Saul was mortally wounded. He knew he was either going to die. If he was lucky, he would die before he was captured, but more than likely, he was going to be captured, and they were going to shame him and humiliate him before they executed him. And so it's basically a quick reference to how he was killed in the battle with the Philistines. And so what we see here, if we go through the appropriate timeline, is we see Saul basically goes to battle with the Philistines. He's wounded. He knows he's going to be captured, so he kills himself. Then this Amalekite, while Saul's body is still laying on the battlefield, comes across it, sees an opportunity for his own gain. So he steals his wristlets and his crown. The next day, the Philistines come across Saul's body on the battleground, and so they basically take it, they behead him, and they strap it to the wall of the city. And this is something that was commonly done back in this day to shame the king, to show that they had killed the king of an enemy nation. Then we see some men travel from Gilead. They travel overnight. They take Saul's body. They actually burn it, and then they bury the bones, basically trying to preserve Saul's integrity, try to keep him from disrespecting their king. And then the next thing we would see in this chronological order is the Amalekite finally arrives at David's camp, and he approaches David claiming that he killed King Saul himself, which we know was a lie, and he paid dearly for it by being executed. So my challenge to you, when you come across stuff like this that is presented as the Bible being untrue or untrustworthy, always investigate it, because this is how I started my walk. I started reading the scriptures, the gospel specifically, and I started having questions. How does evolution play into this? Can miracles really happen? Was Jesus a real person? And I sought answers for these questions, because if I could disprove it, I knew Christianity wasn't real, and all I wanted was to know what I believed, one way or the other. So investigate these claims, and that's lesson number one that we learned. Lesson number two is always, when you're studying, context is vital. Make sure you're reading in the appropriate context. People take stuff out of context all the time. We can't just quote or read one verse and put any kind of appropriate meaning to it. We have to know the context of everything. We have to know why the author was writing, who they were writing to, and the totality of what's going on, in order to get the true context. Because when we're reading, we need to read as though we were this person back in the time that this was written to them. We're not reading in the modern time and putting our own modern interpretations on it. We need to understand it as they would have understood it back then. So if you like this video, please like it, subscribe so you can see the next ones, hit the notify button, and it'll tell you when I post another video. Typically I post every other day except Sundays, but if you have any other topics, send them my way. And until the next video, I love you guys. Blessings.